Have you ever felt called to do something that made absolutely no sense to anyone around you? Something so uncomfortable, it made you question everything that was Ezekiel's reality. He was chosen by God to deliver a message through obedience, strange, difficult obedience. Ezekiel lived during a time of deep spiritual crisis. The people of Israel had turned their backs on God, chasing after idols and false hopes. They were headed toward destruction, and God, out of mercy, wanted to give them one final wake-up call. God didn't send Ezekiel to shout from rooftops or debate in the synagogue. No, God asked him to live the message, to become a walking, breathing symbol of what was to come. His life would speak louder than any sermon ever could. One day God gave him a command: take wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt, mix them all together. That will be your bread. It wasn't about cuisine, it was about scarcity. This was siege food, what people eat when survival becomes desperate. But there was more. Ezekiel wasn't just to bake this bread and eat it. He was told to measure it strictly. Each day, he could eat only a small amount. Same with water, measured, restricted. This represented the hunger and thirst coming soon. God was painting a picture. Through Ezekiel, people would see what it looks like to live under siege, to suffer, to starve, to long for even a sip of water. It was harsh, but it was also a final cry and for then repentance. God said something even more shocking. Bake the bread using human dung as fuel. Yes, human waste. Not only symbolic of poverty, but of shame. A deep, humiliating message of just how far his people had fallen away. Can you imagine Ezekiel's reaction? This wasn't pride or rebellion, it was pain. He cried out, "Lord, I have never defiled myself." For his entire life, he had followed the purity laws. He had honored God with his body and his choices. God heard Ezekiel's plea, and in his kindness, he allowed a change. Very well, God said, you may use cow dung instead. It was still strange, still humbling, but it was a compassionate gesture. God met Ezekiel in his obedience and fear, so Ezekiel obeyed. Day after day, he went outside in full view of the people. He baked his bread over cow dung, measured each bite, drank his rationed water, and said nothing. His silence shouted the warning louder than any words. People must have walked by and stared. Children probably whispered. Some laughed, some were confused. But Ezekiel didn't flinch. He kept going. Because this wasn't about him. It was about the people. It was about God trying one last time. The bread was dry, bitter. The fire smelled of filth. The water was barely enough to swallow it down. Yet every part of the ritual had meaning. Ezekiel wasn't just acting. He was delivering a prophecy, one mouthful at a time. God didn't enjoy making Ezekiel do this, but he loved his people too much to let them walk blindly into ruin. Sometimes love looks like warning. Sometimes mercy is messy. Sometimes a prophet has to look foolish to open blind eyes. Have you ever been in Ezekiel's shoes, doing something God placed on your heart while everyone else around you thinks you're strange? Staying faithful in a world chasing shortcuts. Sometimes obedience looks like standing alone in public with a cow dung fire. Faith isn't always glamorous. Sometimes it's raw. It's slow. It costs your comfort. It costs your image. But when God calls and you answer with a trembling yes, it moves things in the spirit even if no one else sees it yet. Ezekiel's bread wasn't about Ezekiel. It wasn't about humiliation for fun. It was about reaching a people who had stopped listening. Words had failed, so now God turned his prophet into the message. A human billboard pleading, "Please turn back." How often do we miss God's whispers because they don't come in the form we expect? We want thunder, miracles, signs. But sometimes God speaks through a man baking bread with cow dung, through the unusual, through the uncomfortable obedience. Through Ezekiel, we learn that God sees the full picture. He knew what was coming to Jerusalem, the pain, the loss. And though judgment had to come, he still tried to reach them before it did. That's mercy wrapped in fire. Ezekiel wasn't just a prophet. He was a mirror reflecting back to the people what they had become. It was hard to watch, harder to accept, but sometimes truth has to sting before it can heal. That's what real love does. And still, Ezekiel didn't complain. He didn't rebel. He didn't run. He obeyed. He stood in the dust day after day, fire crackling beneath him, eating tasteless bread in front of a crowd that didn't want to understand what he represented. Obedience like that comes from trust, a deep, grounded trust in the one who sees what we cannot. A trust that says, even if I don't get it, I'll still go. That's the kind of obedience that moves heaven and earth. Ezekiel single quotes as life challenges us. Are we willing to be misunderstood for the sake of truth? Are we willing to obey, even when it costs, even when it's strange? Because real obedience will always stretch us, but it always brings us closer to God. There's something quietly powerful about Ezekiel's story. It's not filled with thunder or flashy miracles. It's filled with silence, sacrifice, and symbolism, and that's what makes it unforgettable. Sometimes God whispers through the strangest things to reach the hardest hearts. Imagine being Ezekiel. Would you have said yes? Would you have agreed to eat siege bread for months? To cook with cow dung in public? To carry a burden no one else could understand, all because you believed in the voice? Ezekiel reminds us that purpose is bigger than popularity, that conviction must outweigh comfort, that faith means saying yes to God even when no one claps, no one gets it, and it makes you the outsider. And still God sees, God remembers. We don't bake bread overdone today, but we are still called to uncomfortable obedience. Maybe yours looks like forgiving someone who never apologized, or trusting when the money runs out, or stepping back when pride wants to push forward. Maybe your Ezekiel moment is happening right now. You feel unseen, misunderstood, obeying God in quiet ways no one notices. But He notices, and what feels small to you might be changing something eternal. Your obedience still speaks. When we think of Bible heroes, we often imagine warriors, kings, or miracle workers. But Ezekiel shows us another kind of heroism, the kind that says yes in silence, the kind that embraces humility, the kind that stays faithful when it's hard. There's beauty in that kind of faith, the kind that doesn't need applause, that doesn't chase visibility, that obeys simply because it loves God. Ezekiel had that kind of faith, and that's why we still remember his story thousands of years later. God could have picked any method, but He chose bread, fire, a humble prophet. He chose symbolism because stories stick when facts fade. What Ezekiel did in obedience still lingers today, not because it was easy, but because it was true. So next time you're asked to do something that feels small, strange, or difficult, remember Ezekiel. Remember the bread, the fire, the quiet tears, the obedience, and know that when you follow God, no act of faithfulness is ever wasted. Ezekiel shows us that even the strangest assignments have purpose, that discomfort can carry divine meaning, that sometimes God's love looks like correction, and that when words fail, lives speak. That's what Ezekiel gave us, a life that spoke louder than words. You may not be called to bake bread with cow dung, but you are called to live with purpose, called to obey when no one else understands, called to love when it's not returned, called to be light in a dark world. God still uses ordinary people for extraordinary messages. He still asks us to trust, to obey, and to carry truth, sometimes in ways we wouldn't expect. Like Ezekiel, we may not always understand, but we are never forgotten. Obedience is sacred. It costs us something, but it gives us more: peace, purpose, God's presence. And in the end, that's what matters most. Not the crowd's approval, but God's smile. Ezekiel understood that. And because of it, his story lives on. Ezekiel's single quote says bread was never about food. It was about the heart, about reaching people who had closed their ears, about reminding a nation that God still cared enough to warn, to wait, and to call them home before it was too late. What will your story be? Will it be one of comfort or calling? One of pleasing people or obeying God? Like Ezekiel, you don't need to be perfect, just willing to say, "Here I am," and let your life speak. So when God whispers something hard, something strange, listen. When he asks for your trust, even when it's uncomfortable, trust. Your obedience could be someone else's awakening. That's what Ezekiel's bread did. That's what yours could do too. You don't have to understand everything God asks. You just have to know the one asking is good. Faith doesn't always make sense, but it always makes purpose. And when you walk in obedience, heaven stands with you just like it did with Ezekiel. Thank you for watching this story. If it spoke to your heart, consider sharing it. Remember, even the most unusual assignments can carry eternal purpose. And sometimes, the quietest obedience leaves the loudest echo in history. See you in the next story.